Well, our second reading today comes from the letter of St. James, which has a lot of really practical wisdom. Today we hear him say, religion that is pure and undefiled before God includes taking care of widows and orphans and keeping oneself unstained from the world. So he's telling us that in addition to worshiping God, we ought to also love others and take spiritual care of ourselves. So I want to look at those two things today. Why does he mention widows and orphans? Well, in the Old Testament, widows and orphans are given as like an example of those to whom God shows his favor, those for whom he looks out after and who the people of God should also look out after. And God threatens those who take advantage of them. But in this context, I think the reason why he mentions widows and orphans is because they are people who cannot repay those who do good to them. You know, they were the ones that didn't have anything to give back. And that's really important because oftentimes our charity, our love for other people includes being repaid. You know, I'll do this for you, you do that for me, and then we're good. And that's just a different way of loving ourselves. But what he's telling us is that we should do good to people who cannot repay us. And this is what Jesus taught as well. Whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do for me. So taking care of the poor and the weak, those who cannot repay us, that's what Jesus asks of us. A great example of this is St. Vincent de Paul. He was a great French priest in the 17th century, and oftentimes he's depicted as having a little child in his arms, whether it's in an image or in a statue. And that's because one day he was walking down the streets of Paris, and there he saw a newborn infant that was just left on the road. And he scooped up that little child and took him to the proper place where they took care of those children. But what he saw there terrified him. It was really a poor place that didn't have what they needed to take care of all those children. And many of them subsequently died because of the lack of proper care. So he went to his religious sisters that he had founded, these nuns, and said, we have to do something. And within 10 years, every orphan in Paris, which was 4,000 of them, were taken care of by St. Vincent de Paul and his sisters. And he knew the name of all 4,000 of those children. And if one of them should die, he would grieve as if he lost his own, because he cared for them. He wanted to give them what they needed, also to give them the sacraments. And they did this for a long time. And then but the sisters said, we can't sustain this. It's taking too much of our resources. And St. Vincent de Paul told them, we cannot give up. We can't give up. Imagine what we would be doing if we closed these places down. And he had this great principle, God does our work when we do his. And so he had this great confidence, no, we have to continue. And they did continue and did a lot of good. It's a great example of taking care of those who can't repay us. That second part, just to bring this to a conclusion, St. James tells us that we ought to keep ourselves undefiled by the world, unstained by the world. And here, when he talks about the world, he's talking about the fallen world. It's the evil world. And I think the best way to do that is to live out the teachings of Jesus and his church. In our first reading, we heard about the reason why the law of God was so important, and then Jesus tells us that we have to keep it within our hearts as well. And so this is really the best way to keep ourselves unstained by the world, by following what the church teaches, proclaiming what Christ teaches. And people might say, well, this limits our freedom. And G.K. Chesterton, he responded to this once. He said, yes, it's true that Catholic doctrine and discipline is a wall, but it's like the wall of a playground. And he said, imagine this. Imagine there's an island that it's really has tall, and on the top of it there's a grassy hill. And on the sides where there's a cliff, there's actually a wall there. He says, if you put children in that place, they could run around. They would play all their games. They might be scared about throwing the football off the cliff, but they wouldn't be scared about the receiver running off the cliff because the wall is there. And he says, now imagine the walls were knocked down And what would the children be doing? Well, they wouldn't be falling off. What they would be doing instead is staying very close to the center, kind of terrified of what could happen. And he says that's the difference between living out our faith in the world and not doing that. So people might tell us, yeah, well, we have extra freedom if we don't follow these teachings. And the truth is, living in the world without Christ, without the church, is a terrifying thing, and it brings a lot of anxiety and fear. And so that's why it's important that we do this. And we can say, think about 2,000 years of remarkable men and women whom we call the saints, those that are canonized like St. Vincent de Paul, uncanonized ones like some of our ancestors, and how their following of these teachings have brought them to flourishing. And so what St. James says is very important. If we want to have a true religion, we not only must worship God, we must take care of our neighbors and take proper care of ourselves, keeping ourselves undefiled by the world.